War with Granada begins. Isabella had begun her reign with the firm determination to capture Granada, the last stronghold of the Muslims in Spain. By putting a clause in the marriage contract, she had forced a promise from Ferdinand to help her. Proud, tiger-hearted old Muley Hassan, the Sultan of Granada, scoffed at the idea of losing his kingdom to the young Queen of Castile and her inexperienced husband. To begin with, they had a hard enough time keeping control of their own kingdom without trying to capture his. And how could his Granada possibly be taken? The land of Granada was studded with fortresses to the very border of Castile. Thick as seeds of a pomegranate, they were scattered throughout the valley. The city of Granada, which held his Alhambra, the most beautiful palace in the world, was built on a rocky height impossible to scale. Granada could never be captured unless it be the will of Allah, from whose will there was no protection. Having no fear of Ferdinand and Isabella, old Muley Hassan had not paid the annual tribute which sultans for years past had been accustomed to send to the sovereigns of Castile. His answer was ready and waiting for the day when the Spanish ambassadors should arrive and demand payment. That was a day in 1476. The old sultan received them in the audience hall of the Alhambra, seated cross-legged on a large satin cushion. He wore a tremendous turban decorated with an ornament of jewels. In scornful silence he watched the Spanish ambassadors approach. With no change in expression, he listened to their suave and tactful request for the tribute to be paid to their sovereigns. Then he gave his well-considered answer. "Tell your sovereigns," said he, "that the sultans of Granada, who paid tribute to the kings of Castile, are dead. Our mint coins nothing for them now but scimitars and swords." The Spaniards returned with the Sultan's answer. Up to this time, Ferdinand had been lukewarm about Isabella's proposed war with Granada, but when the ambassadors brought back no tribute money, nothing at all but an insolent answer, Ferdinand was for making war on Granada at once. "I will tear the seeds from that pomegranate one by one," he snarled, using the word for pomegranate, which in Spanish is Granada. "That overbearing infidel should be wiped off the earth." Isabella finally calmed her husband and made him see that war with Portugal must be finished first before war with Granada could begin. Their delay in answering his challenge made Muley Hassan still more scornful. His scimitars and swords were ready and sharp, and an army of fierce, faithful men were ready to use them against the Christian infidels. One wild night in 1481, he made a surprise attack on the Spanish fortress of Zahara, just across the border. He captured it with an awful slaughter, taking the Christians who survived back with him to Granada to be sold as slaves. Entering the city gates, he was greeted with wailing and moaning, as if this victory were the forerunner of disaster. "Woe, woe," moaned a whirling dervish. "Now will come the fall of Granada. Woe, woe to our beautiful Granada." The loss of the fortress of Zahara came as an unexpected shock to Ferdinand and Isabella. To retaliate, a Spanish army struck back at a Muslim fort on the border and captured it. Thereupon Muley Hassan surrounded this fortress and cut off all supplies from the Spaniards, hoping to starve them into surrender. The Spanish generals were uncertain whether or not to burn the fort and desert it. The royal council believed the cost of holding it would be too great, both in money and in lives. "Every war must have heavy cost," said Isabella. "We are determined to conquer Granada. To surrender the first fortress we have taken would be weak and cowardly." As always, the Queen's courage and determination carried the day. The Spanish held the fort. Muley Hassan, having lost it, also lost the confidence of his people. This defeat added to the strength of an opposing party, who had long been sick of the tyrant and already been plotting to replace him with his son Boabdil. From then on it was to be father against son, with the Arabs divided, fighting one another instead of uniting against the Spanish, who might not otherwise have conquered them. Boabdil was a mild young Arab who was called the Unlucky. It was his misfortune to become the last Sultan of Granada. On the day of his birth, astrologers casting his horoscope had called him the Unlucky One. Whatever unhappy combination of stars and planets shone above his cradle, the true misfortune of the young Sultan lay in his feeble character, his lack of inner strength and courage. His mother was a beautiful Christian slave girl who had long been the favorite wife in Muley Hassan's harem. When she was replaced by one younger and more beautiful, she became jealous and fearful that her son might be set aside by his father. So she became the center of a plot to depose Muley Hassan and seize the throne for Boabdil. Muley Hassan soon discovered the plot and had the mild-mannered son and his scheming mother locked up in a tower. Zoreya knotted her colored scarves into a long rope one dark night and let Boabdil down to the river bank below, where horses were waiting. He escaped to a town in the mountains, where he remained until he had word to return in haste and be proclaimed the new Sultan. That was a day which Muley Hassan had spent in a pleasure garden outside the city walls, with the latest beauty of his harem. At sunset, returning, he found the gates of Granada barred against him, and remembering an old prophecy, he cried aloud at his fate, "Allah Akbar! Such is the will of Allah! Allah Akbar!" El-Zagal the Bold, another relative, now entered the family feud. He was Boabdil's uncle, a really great warrior, justly known as the Bold. El-Zagal joined his exiled brother, Muley Hassan, and helped him establish a new capital on the Mediterranean coast at Malaga, a city so fair and lovely that the Arabs called it their paradise on earth. High mountains encircled and protected Malaga. Nevertheless, with Muley Hassan there, the Spaniards made an attempt to scale the mountains and capture the city. The soldiers were urged on with the promise of robbery and plunder. Fierce old Muley Hassan did not sit still in his paradise and wait for the invaders. With a mere handful of men, he went forth to meet them in the mountains and left so many dead that from then on the mountains of Malaga were known to the Spaniards as the Heights of Slaughter. Isabella could not understand this awful defeat. She considered this a holy war against infidels. How had the Lord allowed it to happen? A curate spoke the truth. Robbery and plunder, not the service of the Lord, had been the main thought of the majority of people. The Muslims were giving thanks to Allah for their victory. The Muslims were giving such high praise to Muley Hassan that Boabdil could see that he also needed to win a victory. For this, he chose to attack the Spanish town of Lucena. It was an April morning in 1483 when the young Boabdil set out from Granada with his troops, a murky morning filled with evil omens. The first occurred in the gateway, when his horse stumbled and he broke his lance. Later, crossing a field, a fox dashed in front of him and ran through the whole army, which was enough to make the bravest men very jittery. At Lucena, they found the Spanish governor so bold and defiant, they feared that a huge army was behind him. At the first encounter, panic struck the Arabs. They fled in disorder, and only a few escaped death. Boabdil was found and captured, crouching under a bush. Next day, the watchtowers of Granada were packed with people waiting for a messenger to return with news of victory. "How goes it," they cried, "with the Sultan and the army?" "There they lie," gasped the man, pointing toward Spain. "The heaven fell upon them. All are lost." "Upon that sad note," said an Arab chronicler, "wailing was heard from palace to cottage. All Granada joined to deplore their brave young monarch cut down in the promise of youth. Fugitives from the battle then came straggling in with the truth. How Granada railed at the cowardly young sultan who had allowed himself to be captured. Old Muley Hassan was again their hero. They threw open the gates to him and hailed him once more as their rightful sultan. Boabdil had been taken prisoner, but now that Ferdinand and Isabella had him, they did not keep him, knowing that it would suit Muley Hassan far too well. Instead, they sent him back to stir up more trouble. Boabdil had barely established himself in the seaport of Almeria when his brave uncle El-Zagal attacked the town and tried to capture his nephew, miserable traitor that he was. Boabdil barely escaped. Then, not knowing where else to go, he scurried back to Cordova and begged protection of Ferdinand and Isabella. The old sultan, Muley Hassan, restored to Granada, kept the confidence of the people until he lost another fort to the Spaniards. Then another wailing swept through the city, and another outcry against him. El-Zagal now appeared as the only one of the royal family who could save the Arab people from disaster. They sent a message to him, and the brave old warrior entered Granada in triumph to be hailed as the new sultan. Muley Hassan soon became ill and died, which again left but one sultan in Granada, a peaceful situation which Ferdinand and Isabella could not allow to continue. Boabdil was shipped home again, with enough money and men to regain his throne and keep the country once more upset and divided. In return, Boabdil weakly promised to surrender the capital city of Granada as soon as Malaga and all the other bravely defended Arab forts should be captured by the Spanish. On January 6, 1481, the year that the Holy War against the Muslims began, a holy fire was lighted in Seville, and 6 men and women were burned to death for the good of their souls, so it was said, so that they need not be burned hereafter in the fires of hell. By the end of the year, 300 had been burned to death, and within the next 10 years, about 3,000. All had been convicted of being heretics, Christians whose belief was not considered to be in step with the Roman Catholic Church, or converts suspected of slipping back into the original Jewish or Muslim religion. The man who passed judgment and stoked the unholy fire was Tomas de Torquemada, a Dominican friar, a thin, sallow, self-righteous man who had been confessor to Isabella when she was a girl. Now he easily convinced the queen that she could never make Spain a united country if she tolerated any religious differences. All dissenters must be searched out and done away with. To do this, the Inquisition, an ancient tribunal for hunting down heretics, must be revived. His words were so eloquent that he persuaded Isabella that what he proposed was actually the will of God. As for Ferdinand, he looked forward to getting his greedy hands on the wealth and property of the victims. So the Inquisition was reestablished. Torquemada was appointed Inquisitor General for all of Spain, and the insane manhunt began. On a midsummer day in 1485, Columbus, with a small boy holding his hand, might have been seen trudging up a path from the harbor of Palos in southern Spain toward a windy gray-green bluff to which clung the low red-tiled buildings of a monastery. The small boy was his 5-year-old son, Diego, whose mother, Felipa, was now dead and buried in Lisbon. There, too, at home in Lisbon, Uncle Bartholomew was still making maps. The boy Diego did not know why he and his father had to come away. All of a sudden they had hurried aboard a ship, and here they were in this lonesome place, walking up a hill, and he was thirsty. Columbus had caught sight of the monastery even before the ship came to anchor. There, he thought, he might leave Diego, while he found a way to present his plan to Ferdinand and Isabella. Columbus knocked on the monastery gate. An old porter in his brown Franciscan habit squinted up at the stranger with a smile. "Bread and water for the little one?" he asked. "Yes, indeed. Come and welcome. This way." He led them into the friary, which was to be home to small Diego for the next 6 years. And Columbus must have been pleased when he found that the head of the Franciscan monastery, Fray Juan Perez, had been a former confessor to Queen Isabella. Fray Perez was most interested in the project of this enthusiastic stranger who had come his way. He felt sure that Fray Antonio de Marchena, head of all the Franciscans near Seville, who was also an astronomer, would be most sympathetic and helpful, and so he proved to be. His advice was to see the Count of Medina Celi, who had a merchant fleet and could supply 3 or 4 caravels Columbus needed. But for so unusual an enterprise, the Count felt that he should receive royal permission. In reply to his request, the Queen ordered Columbus to come to court that she might see the man from Genoa herself. Isabella was then in Cordova, the main army base, with her 4 children, Isabel, Juana, and the 3-year-old Maria, nurses, ladies-in-waiting, and all the officials and members of the court. Ferdinand was with his generals in the field. As the autumn rains began, he rejoined the family in Cordova, and they traveled north to spend the winter at Alcala. On December 16, 1485, Catalina, the last of Isabella's children, was born and named for her mother's English grandmother, Catherine of Lancaster. This little girl was to become Queen of England, the ill-fated Catherine of Aragon, wife of Henry VIII. In January, therefore, when Christopher Columbus arrived in Cordova, all he could do was wait until the Queen returned in April. Cordova was a good place to wait, a fascinating old city, rich in the marvelous architecture of the Arabs. Walking through the old mosque with its hundreds of alabaster columns was like walking through a fabulous forest made of stone. Sightseeing alone, however, could not fill months of idle hours. Columbus still had time on his hands. Near one of the city gates he found an apothecary shop run by a man from Genoa, a popular meeting place for doctors, astronomers, and various scientists, as well as amateurs listening to their conversations. There he met young Diego de Harana, who one day invited Columbus home with him for dinner. Diego's father, a wine presser by trade, was an intelligent, cultured man. So was his mother. Living with them were 2 young cousins, orphans, Pedro Enriquez de Harana and his sister Beatriz. Beatriz had a shy, sweet smile for the handsome stranger, and 3 years later she was to become the mother of his son Ferdinand. Pedro de Harana, her brother, was to command one of the ships on Columbus's 3rd voyage to America. Her cousin Diego was to go on the first voyage, which as yet was nothing but a dream, and a subject for speculation in the old apothecary shop. April 1486 came at last. The royal family returned. Ferdinand went on to join the army for the spring campaign. The Queen and their children took up residence in the Alcazar. which had been the Sultan's palace in the days when the Arabs ruled Spain and their capital city was Cordoba. One day in May, Columbus was summoned to an interview. So it was in Cordoba, in the Alcazar, on a day in May 1486, that Christopher Columbus and Queen Isabella met for the first time. On this May day, as Columbus knelt down before her, Isabella saw a man of her own age, 35, of much the same sturdy build and reddish-blonde coloring. This, then, was the man, the adventurous Italian from Genoa, who had the curious idea of sailing westward to the Indies. Isabella listened attentively while he set forth his marvelous idea. She was impressed by the confidence he had in his own ability to cross the sea to India and bring back its treasures. Was sailing westward too difficult and costly to be worth the venture? If not, could the royal treasury afford to finance it? She assured Columbus that she would have a committee appointed to study the problems involved in the enterprise, and arranged for him to live with the royal treasurer. Very soon Isabella left Cordoba, having received word from Ferdinand that the soldiers needed encouragement. She left for the front, taking with her the Infanta Isabel, now her favorite companion, as well as many ladies of the court and a troop of cavaliers and guards. The mere sight of their queen was enough to raise the spirits of the soldiers, and when she spoke she made them feel that they were crusaders in a holy war, as truly as if they were trying to recapture Jerusalem. By the late fall, Moclin had fallen, as well as many other forts that barred the way to Granada. Ferdinand returned to Cordoba, where the court was preparing for the annual trek north. The winter of 1486 was spent in Salamanca, a university town northwest of Madrid. Columbus accompanied the court, as did the committee who had been studying his enterprise. One of the committee members took Columbus to live with him in the Dominican monastery. Columbus was well aware that most of the committee considered his project impractical, but the simple friars of the monastery had faith in him. In his search for arguments to present to the skeptical committee, Columbus was pleased to have found a French author who thought that the size of Asia was wider and the ocean narrower than Ptolemy had admitted. This is what he said: "The ocean which stretches between Spain and the western edge of India is of no great width, and the sea is navigable in a very few days if the wind be fair." What did the worthy gentlemen of the committee say to that? Did it convince them? It did not. However, it was decided not to make too hasty a report. After all, it was only spring, less than a year since they had begun to deliberate. So spring came again, time again to move south. The royal family, the court, the committee, and Columbus all packed up and journeyed back to Cordoba. And as usual, Ferdinand went south to join the army for the spring campaign. No one knows what Columbus found to do in the spring of 1487, other than to read and wait and hope. The spring of 1487 brought the siege of Malaga, the lovely Mediterranean seaport which the Arabs called their paradise on earth. Ferdinand turned upon its walls a constant bombardment, using the most powerful cannon that the munition makers imported from Germany were able to produce. The Arabs fought desperately, making furious sallies from their fortress against the Spanish troops. In one encounter, Ferdinand himself was nearly killed. When Isabella arrived at camp to stay until Malaga surrendered, the booming of the big guns was almost incessant, and the towers of the city all but hidden by the smoke. At her request, the firing ceased, while a messenger of peace was sent to the Muslim general, offering generous terms if he would surrender. If not, when Malaga was captured, Ferdinand gave warning that he would make slaves of every man, woman, and child still alive in the city. Hamet Azali, the proud defender of Malaga, sent back the Spanish messenger with no reply, and threatened death to any coward among his men who even dared to utter the word surrender. Help was surely on the way, he told them. In that he was both right and wrong. Old El Zagal, the Bold, was indeed on his way to relieve the city, but the traitor Boabdil was also on the way. His troops attacked the forces of his uncle and prevented them from reaching Malaga in time to rescue the starving defenders. And so, all hope gone, Hamad Zali was forced by his officers to open the gates. The Spaniards rushed in and sacked the city. Ferdinand kept his threat to the letter. Just a week after the surrender of Malaga, Columbus received a summons to go to the royal encampment and also sufficient funds to make the journey from Cordoba. With what a high heart he must have told his skeptical friends in the apothecary shop that the sovereigns had sent for him. How far he must have sailed in his imagination on the way to Malaga. But when he got there, he found no reason to have come. The committee had made no report. The sovereigns had no time to see him. They were too busy preparing to leave for Aragon, where Prince Juan, now 9 years old, was to be recognized as heir to his father's throne in a formal ceremony. Columbus had barely a word with them before they left. So what could he do but return to Cordoba? There, on top of his blighted hopes, he had to face the ridicule of those skeptics who had known before he went what would happen. Why would the crazy man think the king and queen would let him sail off for Asia in the wrong direction? A year passed. Columbus was still waiting to hear and still holding his faith under all the scorn and ridicule. Isabella may have remembered, but it is likely that Ferdinand had quite forgotten, in the tangle of international plots and plans in which he was becoming more and more involved with each year.